For 175 years, The Economist has been doing more than reporting news. It's been championing values, promoting open societies, challenging special interests, making the case for decisions based on cold, hard facts. We set the agenda for free trade and globalization. We made the case for same-sex marriage and private space exploration. But in an age of populism, these values are in jeopardy. So we've begun Open Future, a global conversation with critics and supporters on the vital issues of today. From free trade and free speech to immigration, diversity, and technology. It's a conversation we began in 1843 when we argued against tariffs on grain, and continued with other causes like prison reform and ending slavery. We've led the debate on drug legalization and on regulating the titans of tech. Now it's time to shape the agenda for the challenges of the 21st century. A discussion will lead through articles, events, and online debates, in contests, films, and podcasts. It's time to renew the mission for an open future.
Please welcome foreign editor for The Economist, Robert Guest, to the stage.
Good evening, and welcome everybody to our 175th birthday party. People still coming in, come on in. I wouldn't like to say there's plenty of room, but there's some room, some chairs over there. There's a goodie bag on every chair with free copies of our 175th anniversary edition, which is full of great stuff. You are all extremely welcome, and I would also like to say thank you to you all for coming here, despite the typhoon. It's very brave of you, and it's much appreciated. I hope you get home. We are, of course, on a serious note, monitoring the weather, and if we suddenly realize that we're going to have to finish early, we will do so, but we'd really rather not do that. I don't live in Hong Kong, but I got here and I noticed some really sensible advice from the government here on what to do when the storm hits. You find some high ground, you take shelter indoors, hunker down with your friends, and you wait for the storm to pass. You don't try to confront the storm. You don't go up to the top of the peak and shake your fist at it and tell it to go away like King Canute tried to do with the sea. One of those early British efforts of finding the right political system that didn't quite work. You hunker down and wait for it to pass because storms are inevitable and they pass. But what about the other kind of storm? The metaphorical storm, the political storm that has hit the world over the past 5 years. I'm talking about populist nationalism, the movement that gave us Donald Trump, that gave us Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, that gave us extreme governments in Italy. We see flavors of it in the Hindu nationalism of the BJP in India, a party whose senior members sincerely argue that it's the government's job to do something about the love jihad, which is their word for the fact that Muslim guys sometimes fall in love with Hindu women and vice versa, that's something the government should prevent. And we see traces of it also in some of the more nationalist things we're hearing out of the government in Beijing. This is a big and incredibly disruptive movement, and it's one that we, The Economist, who for 175 years have stood for liberal values, find very troubling. Some people think that the way to approach this storm is pretty much the same as the way you would approach a typhoon. That you take the moral high ground, because that's a nice, comfortable place to be, that you hunker down with your friends, and that you hope it's just going to pass, it's just going to go away. We initially, this event, and this is the first of 3 events we're holding in Hong Kong and London and New York, and later we'll be able to tune in to some stuff that's happening in London and vice versa. This whole thing was going to be kicked off by a singer called Emmy the Great. But she, and quite a lot of other people have said that they are not prepared to take part in the Open Future Festival because we have also invited Steve Bannon, the guy who is one of the architects of Donald Trump's revolution in America. And they say that because this man represents nationalism and xenophobia, that they're not going to share a podium with him. And that is absolutely their right to do that, and we respect that, and we respect them as artists, scholars, and individuals. But that is not what The Economist stands for. When we see a big global political movement that we disagree with, we fight back. And it's not as hopeless as standing on the top of the peak waving your fist at a storm. When you see someone like Steve Bannon, who we invited because he is the most articulate spokesman of the most important political trend to hit the world in the past 5 or 6 years, we invite him and we debate him. Zanny Minton-Beddoes, our editor-in-chief, will be sitting down with him in New York and grilling him and giving him a hard time. And he's a clever man, so it's going to be a difficult contest. But I am confident that we will prevail today, and ultimately we will prevail. The ideas that we stand for will prevail worldwide. But it's not going to be an easy struggle, and it's not going to happen if we all hunker down with our friends. I think Malcolm Gladwell put it best when he said that a festival of ideas is supposed to be about ideas. If you only invite your friends, that's called a dinner party. In common with dinner parties, actually, we're going to make you think today, but we're also going to make you drink after. We're going to allow you to drink afterwards. There's lots of good stuff through there and lots of exhibits and things that we can do later. There's the blind networking to see how much identity affects the way you relate to people. We have exhibits tied to every one of the 5 pillars of the Open Future campaign. So that's open markets, is capitalism on too short a leash or too long a one? Open ideas. Should I have the right to say anything I like, or should you have the right to silence me? There's open borders. How do we harness the benefits of global migration while reducing the disruption and harm that it sometimes causes? Open society. How should societies, how should countries cope with wrenching social change of all kinds? Open progress. The Economist was founded in the middle of one of the great technological revolutions of the world, the Industrial Revolution, something that raised living standards, lengthened lifespans, and made the world an altogether smaller and yet more fascinating and exciting place. We're still in the middle of a technological revolution. It seems to be accelerating. And the question is it making us happier? These are all things that we're going to grapple with today. We have an app which you can download from the App Store, and it's called something like Open Future, probably. Someone going to correct me on that? Oh, yeah, there you go. I don't even have to say it. There's an app. Everyone download that, and that means you get to see the detailed biographies of all the speakers, which saves me from wasting valuable airtime by listing all their many and superb accomplishments. And we encourage people to ask questions, which you can do on the app, or raise your hand if you want to. We want to have a dialogue here. We want to have a debate. So with that, I welcome you to the first leg, the Hong Kong leg of the Economist's Open Future Conference. And I'm going to invite up onto the stage our first 2 distinguished guests. We have Danny Kwa, the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and Kotaro Tamura of the Milken Institute. Please, if you can both come up onto the stage, and we're going to get right into the debate. Great to have you. Have a seat. Thank you. Wonderful. Please sit down. So, the theme of this session, as you will know if you've downloaded the app, is, roughly speaking, is Asia's future an open one? So I'm going to start with Danny, I think.
Okay.
It's a simple question. Is Asia's future an open one?
Okay, a simple question then. Well, first, happy birthday, Economist. You've been a guide to so many of us for thinking about the world. I'm very pleased to get to be part of this conversation. As for your question, I want to take a leaf from how the Economist tackles difficult questions and say that what Asia needs to do in terms of its future, whether it's open or closed, is that it should, of course, be open, but it should be open in the right way. It should be open to all the good things that emerge from the liberal project. And I mean something by liberal project, I mean something very, very precise, very definite. Not all manner of individual freedoms, but the kind of precision that the Economist uses when it writes about the liberal project. Of course, Asia should be open to all of that, but at the same time, Asia should try and keep out the kind of openness that leads to invectives of hate, race-fueled diatribes, instability, all of which can sometimes come with open systems. So my question, a little bit of a cop-out, but I think the right scientific approach is that it should do both. It should do the right things in terms of being open, and should try its best to refrain from the kind of openness that leads to instability, hatred, the kinds of things that would lead to nationalist populism.
Okay. Kotaro, what is your first take on this?
I hope so, but I don't know. I just finished, our conference yesterday in Singapore, Making Asia Summit. I was sitting in the same panel with the very high-ranking European officials, like a former French Prime Minister, or very high-ranking UK politicians. I'm surprised. I used to think Japanese is the most pessimistic humankind on this planet. But European people sounds more pessimistic about future of this planet, or even Asia. But you're doing good job, Europe. So EU is a big challenge, now in a bit of trouble, but building up a new currency and such a big economic free zone, amazing. You are getting aged, but we are getting old as well. But your population is still growing. Very good job, and you are taking people from outside. In terms of openness, my country, Japan, has a challenge, very homogeneous, and not taking enough people from outside, even though we are getting smaller. Openness sounds like it's about mainly China, but Japan also, we need to open it. But my question is, openness is the best virtue for, I don't know, for the mankind. So, economic prosperity can be the one, and the technological advancement. China, amazing. So I'm, he's literally my boss. I'm a faculty as well in his school. So
I think you all have many jobs when we invite people here.
Seniority system prevails here. So, but China is not very open. But you've been to China recently, probably. I'm amazed by their technological development. In Shanghai, I'm the only guy carrying cash. The people are, everything done by this. So people are staring at me, are you from Stone Age? So, and the biggest EV company, we tend to think it's Tesla. But BYD, Chinese company, is 2.5 times bigger than Tesla. And 80% of the drones in the world are done by Chinese. And, we tend to think Amazon is big. Amazon is taking the world. But, in terms of the transaction amount, Alibaba is 5 times bigger than Amazon. Amazon is trying to penetrate into the fintech, but Alibaba Tencent is already doing fintech. And has the most advanced, fastest supercomputer is done by China. So we have to take it seriously. It's not open, and it's kind of a unique system. They have other view on human rights or privacy, but they are doing great. So now Japan is, I cannot say thank you, but thanks to North Korea and thanks to Mr. Trump, we are getting closer, China-Japan. So, China is the last frontier for us to explore. So, interesting place. I don't know how it opens in many ways. We have to be very careful. They are so powerful, so big, and technologically advanced, as I have mentioned. I don't know, 1.4 billion people can speak freely and openly. But interesting in China, except speaking about politics, you can do anything. So it's interesting place.
Okay.
So
So there's a fundamental division here between the one type of openness. You have the rich democracies, which Japan is one and is in the same sort of position as America and Europe in that you have to grapple with these. You figured out the question of how do you alternate power between different governments, but you have to figure out the question of who's a citizen. The society's aging. Do you let in more people? If so, where from? How do you filter them? How skilled do you want them to be? All these these are very contentious issues in all sort of very rich advanced countries. In China, the question is different. I mean, China poses a fundamental challenge to the notion that the way a society grows more prosperous is by being open and democratic. So maybe we can address that question.
Okay, yeah,
Danny,
certainly.
what's
Thank you. I worry, Robert, that there's a bit of rhetorical trap when we allow our earlier ideological ideas to enter a conversation about openness or closeness, liberal or otherwise. For me, the liberal project has always been about identifying the notion that all humanity can progress through the right ideas and putting in place the kind of social and political systems that allow these best ideas to surface. There's nothing in that description that says that we must be tied only to democracies and electoral ballots as a way of choosing our leaders. What matters is the end result, that humanity progresses, that we improve the lot of humanity, we better the human condition. So it seems to me that the question when we ask whether it's about China or anywhere else in Asia, have these economies been able to put in place structures, put to one side our political prejudices, whether they are democracies or otherwise? Have they been able to put together systems that allow their humanities to progress, that allow there to be a well-defined notion of development, and do their political and social systems surface good ideas in advancement of that goal? If we take that, which I actually take from The Economist, I take that from The Economist and how it describes the liberal project, then we open our eyes, as it were, to how alternative systems, multiple pathways, do produce the kind of liberal open systems that we, for so long, thought the West had monopoly on.
Okay. But in China, you have, obviously it is far more open than it was, a generation ago. You have far more openness in the economy, you have far more openness of thought, you have far more innovation in science. But it's still, they retain some measures of closedness that many people outside China, and indeed many people inside China, find quite shocking. You mentioned the notion of having to have some controls in order to maintain stability. So let me throw some concrete examples at you. Is it necessary for China to keep hundreds of thousands of people in Xinjiang in prison camps in the name of stability? Is it necessary for China to present the free movement of its own citizens under the hukou system? And is it necessary for China to have a leader who has no term limits?
Okay, I'd like to take these in turn, but
Sure.
we might get into quite a bit of detail here. Let me perhaps just give a surface answer to that.
Okay.
One is a statistic that my good friend Kishore Mahbubani likes to quote, is that he says 120 million Chinese tourists leave China every year. 120 million go back. If it were that awful a system that we sometimes caricature it to be, why don't all these people go elsewhere? Okay, but put that to one side. Let's treat each
Fair
of
point.
these instances, let's treat of these cases in turn. The hukou system, as you say, restricts the movement of their own people within the nation. In manifestation, it is not dissimilar to many other systems we practice elsewhere in the world. Okay? Registration of nationals in different districts in France has long been the practice. Of course, it doesn't lead to the kind of...
You're not excluded from public schools in France if you move city.
But you know, if you want to conjure up images of a police state, you have to report regularly to the police station to report on your whereabouts. But all that, I mean, let's think, I think it might be more fruitful to think about what kind of instabilities one might imagine emerging from if we did remove all of these kinds of controls.
What would happen?
There's no way we can actually tell. However, we do have experiments where open systems, systems of speech, systems of writing can get infected by rhetoric of hate that then takes over the operating properties of that system. And this is far too dangerous to experiment in the real world, but there are digital experiments that help us confirm this. Mm-hmm. Take the Microsoft chatbot Tai, powered by artificial intelligence that was then released in the world to try and emulate human behavior. Mm-hmm. What happened to it? It was pulled within weeks of its release because it saw such a barrage of misogynism, a barrage of race hate, a barrage of hate invective, that it turned into a misogynistic, hate-filled, ethnic-hating chatbot. Now, that's an experiment that shows that in certain situations, you do need to be extra careful about what we understand by the good emergent properties of open systems. This is not at all to absolve nation states, governments, who have taken overly draconian an approach to how they punish their citizens. But I'm saying that there's a point in principle that defends the idea that unbridled freedoms of all kinds are not probably what we mean by an open system that has good operating characteristics.
Kotaro, do you think Japan has too many freedoms?
Yeah, compared to our neighbor, I think. So, yes, I used to be a politician. I used to be a member of the Prime Minister Abe's government. So, yes, I always try to think it like if I was Mr. Xi Jinping, what I do to manage 1.4 billion people. So I assume they have more problems inside than outside. They are spending much more money for internal security than building up military muscle. We tend to think, China is building AI. AI means two things: artificial intelligence and artificial island. So they are both building both AI. Some of them are probably in our territory, so we're not very happy. But we worry about that. But they're worrying more about their inside China. That's why they have to do something like what you mentioned, extreme. So yes, it's for them it's not easy. But beauty of this century is that, you can pick the place you want to live. That means, if you are born in one place, you don't need to stick to one place. I was born in countryside of Japan, and I used to be a politician, member of the parliament, but now I'm living in Singapore and doing some job in Hong Kong. And do you like my suits? So this is my family business. I'm selling suits in China, my family. So doing
That was
some
a very
business.
subtle product placement.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think everyone will have got that.
I give you super discount in
There are
black.
rules
So-
against this.
So, yes, you don't need to worry about the place. If you don't like that place, you don't need to live. You can come out. And Singapore is a nice place, a new version of different kind of democracy. So, I feel very safe in Singapore because I think I gave privacy to the government. But, I'm ready to transact my privacy for the safety because I have family there. I have small kids. So, there's many British people living in Singapore. So they talk a lot about privacy, but, if we drink, they tell the same thing. I give up privacy for the safety. So that kind of thing. So I'm sorry, I'm confusing you a lot. But yes, thinking about the place you worry about is very important. But you can pick places. So the place you're born, place you like to go, place you like to work, place like you like to have a family. So I don't need to care about China.
Okay, Danny, before you say this, I'd like to, as soon as Danny has finished speaking, I'm going to open this up to questions. So think about what you want to ask, raise your hand, someone with a microphone will get to you, and you can address it to, any of us.
Since
So, sorry, Danny.
mentioned Singapore and Britain, I thought I would speak to your Hukou point, an
Yeah.
extremely powerful point. I'm an economist, and the way I think about these things is that there are allocation mechanisms. A Hukou system is an allocation mechanism that determines where people live, where people work, and it puts up barriers. Many of us find philosophical, political objection to those barriers. But let me suggest to you other ways in which cities, other countries around the world construct these allocation systems. Until very recently, I used to live in a city where house rents, house prices were so prohibitive that local services within the city could no longer afford to house nurses, teachers, public service workers. The idea that within the central business district, money, high-powered money, the top 1%, foreign investors have bought out so much of the property that rentals and prices are sky high is a familiar one to Hong Kong. The city that I used to live in was London. And in London, you could no longer have ordinary people living within the city because prices were so high. Now, from my perspective, that is one allocation mechanism. That actually is a very terrible one. It keeps out local public services that make for a life that helps the inhabitants improve their condition. But the pricing mechanism has prevented many ordinary people from living within central London. It's a different allocation mechanism.
It's a very similar one, actually, because the reason house prices are so high in much of Britain is because the incumbents, the people who already own houses there, always vote against any effort to build any more houses. So they want to keep their house prices high and shut everyone else out, which is pretty much what happens in Shanghai anytime
Absolutely.
you suggest letting in people with a different hookah.
Absolutely. So I think we need to look beyond the kind of descriptions that then come to us ready-made with possibly political blinders in the case.
Do we have questions in the audience? You can raise your hand. There's a gentleman here. If you can give him a microphone, please. If you can make it a question, not a speech, please.
So the question is, what is openness? And you mentioned about Xinjiang, and compared to the number of American prisoners in jail right now. There are 2.2 million prisoners in jail, mostly African American, disproportionate number. Is it necessary for the U.S. to charge an exit tax, for its citizens to leave compared to the hukou? Was it necessary to elect Donald Trump, and compared to Xi Jinping? And Donald Trump's cohorts can commit crimes, without Donald Trump suffering all that much at this time. So what is more open, the United States or China?
Okay. Who would you like to answer that? Everyone. Shall we pick one of us? Who would like to answer that?
I think the question was directed at you,
Oh,
Robert.
all right. Okay. well, okay. That's very easy then. America is a much more open society than China in many ways. I agree that the prison population in America is too high, and I agree that it is disproportionately, not mostly, disproportionately African American. And we have often argued that jail sentences should be shorter, that prosecutors should have less discretion both in blue-collar and white-collar crimes, and that the various measures that have been put forward to try to reduce prison populations are an excellent idea. Was it necessary to elect Donald Trump? No, but he was elected, and people had a choice, which is not true with the leadership in China. And do people have the freedom in America to pretty much say what they want, live where they want, and do what they want most of the time? I would say yes, having lived there. I confess I've spent a reasonable amount of time in China, but not lived there as long as I have in America. Does one of you disagree with the general proposition that America is more open, for better or worse, than China?
If I may, I might speak to that. I don't know that I would try to quantify whether America is more or less open than China. I think what we have to do is try and think about what the difference, what problem are these different systems trying to solve? Mm-hmm. How have they come to the solutions that they have gotten at? Mm-hmm. America is a system where checks and balances in the electoral system were supposed to prevent the kind of excesses that I think many of us think we see under the Trump administration. Okay, those are not, I mean, the idea that America is simply a political free-for-all is not confirmed by what actually happens in America. Okay. The idea that Xi Jinping had no political legitimacy but was simply plucked out of thin air to be president for life, again, has no...
Not exactly what I said.
Well, I'm caricaturing, obviously.
Fair enough. Paraphrase away.
In my view, is that these different systems have come up with different ways by which they try and float to the surface the political leadership that ought to work for them. Okay. China's system of political meritocracy is one that has features that we can study, and under certain circumstances it produces very good outcomes. Flat referendum, extreme versions of unbridled electoral democracy produce outcomes that I think many of us over the last 2 years have been scratching our heads over. Right? Brexit is one instance where the political machinery that should have constructed a proper argument, come to the right decision, instead abdicated and threw it completely open to 50 million people to take a vote on whether we should leave the European Union or not.
I agree that was a huge unforced error. Do we have... yes, the question over there, please.
Hi, my name is Hafiz. The question I'd like to pose is, when we brought up the concept of, is Asia open enough? Right, my question is not open, is Asia inclusive enough? Mm-hmm. Right, and Asia being traditionally a feudalistic society in general, right? Is it liberal enough to accept inclusiveness, bridging the gap between baby boomers, Gen X, Y, and Z, right? And could you describe a difference between an open system and an inclusive system?
Okay.
Okay.
Kotra, do you want to take that?
I'm not done yet.
Okay, well, briefly then.
Yeah. Going forward, what is a common platform that has or will be used to have an inclusive liberal approach towards society, business order, philosophy, as well as strategy and implementation of future policy?
Okay, Kotaro, simple question for you.
Yeah, I'm not smart enough to answer your question. So I just make a quick comment. I'm going back to his comment, his question as well. So, as to the openness, interesting is happening. So now China is taking advantage of the closeness of the United States. That means foreign talent. Now United States is not welcoming foreign talent, and China is taking advantage of that. So foreign talent in the area of science are vacuum to China right now. China is happy because Mr. Trump is not welcoming those people anymore. And yes, still they're going to the places like very good research institutions or the Silicon Valley startups, but now not like many years until now. So in that sense, China interestingly open to inclusiveness for the talent, global talent, and the United States is interestingly closing for the openness for the global talent. This is the end of my comment. I'm not intelligent enough to speak anymore. So.
Do we have another question? The one at the back, possibly. Is the microphone heading there?
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. So in terms of openness, obviously one thing The Economist advocates for is individual civil liberties in that level of openness. And Asia, the argument here is often that individual civil liberties have to be subsumed in the interests of the state. I'm particularly curious to get Professor Kwa's view on this, particularly considering Singapore as a place where, for example, sodomy is still illegal. I think it's one of the last places with 377A on the books. And do you think that openness in Asia will progress in the direction of more individual civil liberties as the West has?
Yep.
Okay. Well, first, a quick remark. It's quite interesting. From where I sit, openness in Asia has a lot to do with economic trade, economic exchange, trade of goods and services across different countries. Our conversation has not touched very much on that. Mm-hmm. Our conversation has to do with openness within societies. Now, civil liberties, the idea that individuals have rights, they are well defined, that we should have, that the state needs to stand by and provide them, has a good utilitarian justification because it leads to a diversity of views expressed in societies. It makes for something that's culturally vibrant. It makes for good ideas going forwards. As long as those conditions are met, then by all means, let's have the liberties that we need to, the individual freedoms that we need to. When those conditions are not met, and we still need to confront situations where all the people in our society need to advance their station, then the conversation becomes more nuanced. As you might know, in Singapore itself, very recently, in response to a proposal that 377A be relaxed, a petition circulated among ordinary Singaporeans that spoke against that, and it garnered a very large number of votes, a very large number of signatures, very large number of approvals. If by an open society we mean that we respect the rights of the majority, then the question remains still an unresolved one within some parts of Asia. But I think subject to the idea that all of this improves the human condition, of course we should go for that.
That is one of the central questions, to what extent can a majority exert its will over a minority. That's unfortunately all the time that we have there. So if you can join me in giving a warm thank you to Danny Kwa and Kotaro Tamura. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed. Now, thank you. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Miranda Johnson, who's the Southeast Asia correspondent for The Economist, who's going to take you into the next segment, which is a link up with London. Over to you, Miranda.
Thank you, Robert. And for this session, I'm delighted to welcome onto the stage Joshua Wong and Agnes Chow of Demosisto, the political movement here in Hong Kong. If you could both join me on stage, I'd be very grateful. Thank you. Great to meet you. Hi. Thanks for coming, Agnes. Thank you. And we're going to hand over in a sort of technological feat of brilliance in a moment to my colleague Daniel Franklin in London, and we're hoping to have an exchange where, initially I'll ask a few questions to you both, and then Daniel will also hopefully have a few things that he'd like to ask. I mean, if we could both take a seat initially. Obviously, it's 4 years on now from the kind of heat of the umbrella movement. I mean, just before we sort of connect in with London, could you speak to sort of, those heady days and sort of how you felt about events at that time? Was it extremely all-encompassing? Was it, moments I imagine you'll remember forever?
4 years ago, when we occupy on the street to ask for free election and democratization in the city we love, we just aware that it's the time to let the world to aware that Hong Kong is not only a financial center, it's also a place with people that will commit to the future political system reform. And it's the place with people who are ready to pay the price and from action, campaign, to movement, or even civil disobedience to prove that now is the time for us to ask for freedom and free election.
Fantastic. And sort of on that point, I mean, I'd certainly like to discuss more on that as the evening goes on. And I'm also hopeful that just depending on kind of how the technology works with London, how the link works, that we can absolutely throw this open to the floor. But I am just about to pass it over to my colleague Daniel Franklin, who should be appearing on this screen momentarily. Oh yes, fantastic! It looks as though it's working.
I'm handing back to my colleague, Daniel Franklin.
Yeah, I'm going to... We have the link to Hong Kong. Hello, Miranda, over to you. And we're going to be led by Hong Kong, and we'll get the chance to ask some questions in London towards the second half of it. Miranda.
Fantastic. Thanks, Daniel. Well, we have just welcomed onto the stage Joshua Wong and Agnes Chow of Demosisto, and just recapped very briefly on the heady days of the umbrella movement 4 years ago. Initial question, and perhaps Agnes, you can answer this first. I mean, how difficult is it to sustain a political movement that is sparked with such spontaneity and such vigor of feeling? How do you prevent protest fatigue setting in, especially when the umbrella movement led to, some souring, some political division? How do you sustain it?
I would say that it's actually a very difficult thing for us as activists or as political party to kind of sustain the atmosphere that everyone cares about our political system, cares about whether Hong Kong people could enjoy universal suffrage or not. Because the umbrella movement actually was, of course, a very important movement in the historical, in the history of Hong Kong. But after the umbrella movement, there was actually a very, a huge sense of powerlessness created, because Hong Kong people suddenly found out that it's so difficult to fight for even a tiny change in our political system, and it's actually a very difficult thing to fight against the Chinese Communist Party. And we as activists, or as a kind of as a political group, we of course are always trying our best to kind of sustain the atmosphere and hope that more people could care about the political system, and hope that more people would not give up. Even the umbrella movement was not ending with a very good results. But we are also working a lot nowadays recently, but we are still doing a lot of the work in international connections, and doing a lot of promotion works towards the teenagers in Hong Kong. But it's never an easy thing.
Of course. And Joshua, how do you feel that you can sustain this?
fight for democracy is a long-term battle, especially under the hardline approach of President Xi. In the recent year, after the end of Umbrella Movement, leader of Umbrella Movement, just like me, we found our political party. But at the same time, we face political prosecution. I, as the one who have been locked up in prison last year for nearly 100 days, and at the same time, democratically elected lawmakers have been disqualified and kicked out from office under Beijing censorship. At the same time, I think how we need to react on the hardline approach of President Xi is not only a matter for Hong Kong citizens. Last year, we're also aware of politicians from Conservative Party try to enter Hong Kong, but just have been banned and blacklisted. At the same time, now it's possible for foreigners that live in Hong Kong still aware of freedom of speech and also freedom of association. That's a doubt and not easy for us to tackle. But I remember on the word of the year that chosen by Oxford Dictionary last year, youthquake. In the previous day, student or youth might be the one who just enter university to be educated. But with the umbrella movement, no matter people agree or disagree on our approach, we can still let the world aware that youngster could be the one who change the city or even change or even create a new era.
And on that point about changing the city, I mean, you mentioned it yourself a moment ago that Hong Kong is seen as a financial center, and there are arguments made that, you know, the trade-off here is if you introduce sort of greater democracy, you rock the economics, you rock what makes this city stable and prosperous. I mean, what would you counter to that, Agnes?
I'll say that, well, democracy and freedom and human rights for us is like represents the dignity of people. We Hong Kong people, we live in Hong Kong, we're born in Hong Kong, and we really hope that we can decide the future of our own city. That's also the reason why we fight for universal suffrage. It's also the reason why we set up our new political party, Demosisto, which is fighting for democratic self-determination. Because, well, the fate of the city should be decided by Hong Kong people. It should not be only decided by the CCP or just by a minority part by the Hong Kong government. It's not acceptable for us.
Someone might ask, the action we organize is too idealistic or not. But from my point of view, what I hope is just let people in Hong Kong, no matter from which political stand, and also the international community, can recognize the importance to maintain the uniqueness of Hong Kong, especially in the recent month, how we experience or realize the trade war happen might be seriously damaging or generating a negative impact. But why Hong Kong can still maintain the uniqueness is because, of course, no doubt that Hong Kong now is part of China, but we are not recognized part of mainland China. And with the economic freedom, at the same time on how we still recognize the importance of setting Hong Kong as a uniqueness point to reach the Western world and also connected to Chinese society. I hope we fight for democracy, hope to elect the leader of our city. It's not only asking for democratization, but also ensuring the high degree autonomy of Hong Kong, the promise in the Sino-British Joint Declaration.
And on that point about sort of reaching to the West, Daniel, perhaps I could bring you in at this point and you could pose a question for our panelists.
Yes, well, you have several hundred people in the room here in London. What do you think that people in London can do in this process? What is the role of people here, or are we just all spectators?
according to Chinese government official, they always take the approach to claim that Sino-British Joint Declaration is fade away already. Or they might claim that it's none of the business for international community, just like British government, to keep the eyes in Hong Kong. But no matter from political perspective, to recognize the importance of freedom of speech and also freedom of association in this Asian financial hub. Or in the economic perspective, how can we, no matter under trade war or under such tremendous change, we still can preserve and protect Hong Kong as a city that can reach to the Western country, that what we try to figure out. And I hope people who live in London or live in UK could keep the eyes in Hong Kong. No doubt that Hong Kong might be a small and tiny city, but at the same time, it's a place that deserves people support and people keep in the spotlight.
Can I also ask you about China? You spoke about the hardline policies of Xi Jinping. Do you see, and perhaps this is a question for you, Agnes, do you see any prospect for years to come that that approach in China might change? And how important is this, or would this be for you in Hong Kong?
It's of course, I think it's a quite difficult thing for us to like predict China's future, or like to predict like when the Communist Party will end, or like whatever like this. But as a person living in Hong Kong, when we are facing more and more challenges and suppression from the Hong Kong government and also directly from the Chinese government, like for example, I did want to enter the Legislative Council just in January this year, but I was unfortunately disqualified by the Hong Kong government, saying that because I advocate democratic self-determination, which is against the constitution in Hong Kong, that's why I was not allowed to run an election. That my election right, my human right, my political right is being got by the regime. And when we are facing more and more suppression from the Chinese government, although we don't know, like it's difficult to predict China's future, but the most important thing for us is how to get the attention again from more Hong Kong citizens, even from the younger generation, which is younger than us even, to know about what's happening in Hong Kong, to know about what's unfair about Hong Kong, what's problem in Hong Kong's political system. I do know that there are lots of people living overseas. They do really care about Hong Kong when during the umbrella movement. But I hope that this attention can be sustained, even we are not having a huge umbrella movement today. But we hope that, like, even for people living overseas, they can still sustain their attention on Hong Kong's situation, because Hong Kong's situation somehow represents the human rights situation in China also.
And when you talk about the attention from abroad, do you think that people in this country, elsewhere in the rich economies of the world, people tend to be too cautious in speaking up for democracy and human rights in Hong Kong, precisely because they have such a big economic interest in China? So is the desire not to upset China too much because of the power of its economy something that inhibits Western countries in supporting democracy in Hong Kong and elsewhere around China?
There are, of course, a lot of people in Hong Kong, like especially the business sectors, that actually a lot of people from business sectors in Hong Kong, they are pro Beijing because not only because of their own political stance or opinion, but also because they need to keep a good relationship with the Chinese government in order to enter the markets and in order to earn the money in China. But I don't think that it's the reason for us to stop fighting for democracy. You know, even for even for people living in the UK and in the US, they won't say that, well, I will like sacrifice my right to vote in order to let my country to have like better economic situation. I don't think that they're really like that connected. And as I have just said before, democracy is about dignity of people. It's about whether people can decide their own daily life, their own lifestyle, their city's future. So I think we'll still like continue to fight for what we believe is right.
One point I would like to add is what we're asking for, apart from freedom of speech or democratization, we also aware and recognize the importance of check and balance. People might think that if we upset China, it might cause a lot of hesitation and also negative impact to the future development. But from my point of view, I believe in the next 3 or 4 decades, if we need to push forward long-term economic interests, it's a must to recognize Hong Kong should be treated differently compared to mainland China. And that's the reason we hope the world could try to be more understand on we ask for democracy and human rights. At the same time, we hope to maintain the way of living in this city. And I would also point out that Hong Kong, according to Sino-British Joint Declaration, we can implement the one country, two system in the next 50 years. Of course, from an activist perspective, we already aware or conclude it as one country, 1.5 system. But what if, after the end of 50 years, unchanged policy, in 2047, what will happen for the political status and economic status of Hong Kong? Instead of totally directly being determined by Beijing, I believe it must have a say for Hong Kong people for the future of our city after the expiry date of the 50 years unchanged policy referred to the Sino-British Joint Declaration. We hope to determine our future.
Can I just see Miranda before handing back to you? So carry on, Miranda. I was just going to see if there was a question from London before handing back. Is anybody keen to ask? Yes, was it a question from anybody in the room here wanting to ask a question from Hong Kong? Okay, Miranda, back to you.
Oh, right. Well, I was going to jump in, thanks, Daniel, with that point about 2047, which is this kind of totemic year. I mean, in 1997, we were all pretty teeny tiny, not doing a huge amount. And, that generation of political leaders, signed the Joint Declaration and kind of, let it go off into the future. Is this our generation's struggle? Is this, your generation in Hong Kong, is this your struggle? And how will you prepare for 2047? What should happen at that moment?
That instead of waiting or predicting what will happen in the year of 2047, when we see that the situation in Hong Kong, especially for our political system in Hong Kong, our one country, two system, it seems to becoming one country, 1.5 system when China is is imposing more and more suppression and interference on Hong Kong's internal affairs. The most important thing is not to predict what will happen 20, 30 years later, but the most important thing is that we should think about how to call for more people's attention and the participation in the democratic movement in Hong Kong when our human rights are being suppressed in every, I would say every year there are new suppression happening, and there are new way of the government they use to suppress our rights. So what should we do, or how should we react to those suppression? It's the most important question we should think about.
3 decades ago, when we have not born yet, there's a future negotiation on Hong Kong about the arrangement on transfer of sovereignty. However, Hong Kong can't send any delegation or representative to involve in that closed-door negotiation because Beijing refused it. What I hope is, in the previous day or in the last century, Hong Kong, of course, is a colonial city. the generation of my parents or for baby boomers, they might just recognize Hong Kong as the place they borrow or the time that they borrow. And it's not really the place that they generate enough of sense of belongings. But what we hope is if for my generation are aware that people should be the master of their own house, I hope refer to the arrangement 3 decades later on the Hong Kong's future negotiation after 2047, instead of just allowing, I'm not sure if 1 or 2 decades later it's still Xi Jinping, but anyway, I hope it's still the day that let Hong Kongers have a say and even deserve the right to determine the future. Fight for democracy and democratization is a long-term battle. A few years ago, even during Umbrella movement, I've not imagined would be locked up in prison for 100 days. But with our passion and how we are aware on dignity of Hong Kong people, I hope we can make change. If 3 decades ago, we can't determine the future of Hong Kong, and now Beijing claim it is the return to the motherland, or it's just how Hong Kong is just a normal city in China. I hope 3 decades later, that's a different result. It's the time for us to determine our future.
Thank you. At this point, we are going to say goodbye, I believe, to our comrades in London. So thank you for joining us, Daniel, and I hope it's a fantastic day of discussions over there. Bye-bye.
Well, I didn't get a chance to say it to them in person, but I think we can all say a very big thank you in this room to Joshua Wong and Agnes Chow. It's fantastically interesting.
Technological nightmares. But at this point, we can open it up to the floor for questions. Oh, yes, there was a very quick hand at the back there. Thank you very much.
As a very little child, when I was growing up in Beijing, I literally heard all the gunshots of the Tiananmen massacre. That was Beijing's response to a largely peaceful protest. We have PLA soldiers stationed just 10 minutes walk away from here. Would you be prepared for that kind of threat? Thank you.
I would say that during the Umbrella movement, there was actually lots of rumors during the Umbrella movement that the Tiananmen massacre would happen again 4 years ago. And, well, I would not say we are all like all of the pan-democrats or all of the pro-democracy citizens in Hong Kong are all like very mentally prepared for being killed or for being like for being killed by the regime. But well, I of course hope that the Tiananmen massacre would not be happening in Hong Kong even in the future. But if you ask about the possibility, I think it's a very difficult question. It's always related to whether the Chinese government would like to take even a harder line towards Hong Kong in the future, but I hope that this day would not happen.
I would say that I am not mentally prepared to sacrifice my life for democracy. I have experienced to be locked up in prison, but sacrifice my life is really too far away. But I would say that what we do today is to prevent massacre, just like what happened in 1989 in Tiananmen Square, happen again in Hong Kong.
Thank you. I'm afraid on that somewhat somber note, we'll have to end it, and I will welcome onto the stage the next panel. But please join me in thanking both Agnes and Joshua. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming, Agnes. You've got this way. And I now welcome up my colleague Dom Ziegler for an open markets panel.
Thank you, Miranda. Can you hear me?
No. Did I lose it?
Could I maybe borrow another microphone?
I think I'm not mic'd anymore.
Could I invite my panelists, fellow panelists, to join me, please, for this session? I'm on now? Great. So if I could please invite my panelists here, I'd love them to sit here with me. When Miranda said, of course, we were all teeny tiny in 1997, I went, ouch. And that was a blow to me. Another blow was listening to Joshua and Agnes talking so passionately about the need to expand the dignity of Hong Kong people and expand their political space. Because in 1997, in the cover editorial that we wrote, we got it very, very wrong, and I should know because I wrote the first draft. We argued that not only would Hong Kong be a conduit for ideas to flow into China, but that also the extraordinary economic growth that China was experiencing, the economic liberalization would surely then lead to political opening. So we got that very wrong. I would like to introduce my panelists and ask them the question of whether we should have worried about it, whether indeed the fact that we haven't got a politically liberal China is something we should worry about. So you're very, very welcome indeed. From my far left, Daniel Bell from Shandong University, Mei Li from Exnode, which is which helps startups in China, and Sharon Hom from Human Rights in China. Daniel, could I maybe start with you? The Economist was wrong in terms of predicting China's political direction. Should we worry?
Well, I think there's a great diversity in China, right? We have here a fully and proudly capitalist city, which is kind of unusual and maybe in some ways beautiful, very open. And we have in Beijing a kind of communist, city leading the rest of the country. But I'm in Shandong province, which is proud of its Confucian heritage. So there's a very, in this sense, there's a very diverse and inclusive society. And should there be one model that determines the whole country? I mean, I'm not sure that's a good idea. I think there's tons of problems in China, but the fact that there are diverse directions, I think, is a good thing overall.
Well, now you've written lots of very, very interesting analysis and interpretations of how, in some ways, China's political system conforms to certain Confucian tenets. So perhaps could you explain for us what is Confucian about the system? Some of us will be sitting from outside. We'll see that, for instance, in Hong Kong, the Communist Party in Beijing sets red lines. If you call for free and fair elections here that Beijing has no say in, that's out. In the far west of China, in Xinjiang, which the first session touched on, there are detention camps that hold probably 200,000 or 300,000 people at anyone's best guess, that thought reform is something that's practiced on people who are taken out of houses, that Muslim Uyghurs' houses have QR codes that can be scanned by the local security services on their doors, and that big data is used to try to predict and then apprehend transgressors who are defined by the state. So we see from outside sort of repression, authoritarianism. You see something different.
No, I mean, I don't see something that different. I think there are ideals inspiring the system that are different than the ideals inspiring the system in, for example, in Canada, where I'm from. One of them is the ideal of political meritocracy, the idea that to select and promote political leaders, they're supposed to have a prolonged political experience and a record of achievement, and that you can't just leave it up to the people based on their momentary whims to select political leaders. But that doesn't mean that there's no commitment to basic human rights. I mean, at the surface level, at least at the rhetorical level, and this is very common in other countries, people agree on basic human rights. Don't kill innocent people, don't torture, slavery is bad. But when it comes to how to select and promote political leaders, then I think we should allow for a difference. And this is where the ideal of political meritocracy has a long history, and it's being realized in a highly imperfect form today. The other ideal is the ideal of harmony. And in English, it sounds very pejorative, right? When you think of harmony, it sounds like conformity or uniformity. But in Chinese, I mean, every Chinese intellectual knows this saying from the Analects of Confucius that 君子和而不同, right? That exemplary persons should value harmony but not diversity. You have a tremendously huge country like China, so we should allow for diverse ways of expressing ideas, and there shouldn't be one model. I mean, I love The Economist, a beautiful magazine, but with all due respect, there is one pretty rigid model for what counts as a good society, and this way perhaps we should allow for differences in China. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, harmony and meritocracy, I think, are two themes that later I'd love to open up to the floor over, because I think these are I'd love to hear some debates and viewpoints from the floor about this. But May, could I ask you, as somebody who does business in China, does the politics matter? Not just in terms of ease of business, but does it ever worry some of your startups that, that their tech may be helping the state in ways that maybe investors wouldn't approve of?
So I just want to say by way of background that actually my most recent 10 years in China has all been in higher education. First for NYU and then most recently for a Chinese university. And it's that recent 10 years in my 30-year history in China that's going to inform my next set of comments. I think that this question of political systems and economic growth is one where reasonable people can differ. And I have to say that I am Chinese American, but I have a long history in China. I have tremendous respect for what China has accomplished over the last 30 years with respect to its economic growth and with respect to the progress that it's made in the country. But I have to say at the same time that I think that the American experiment in democracy is one of extraordinary audacity, and if you read the Constitution, of incredible wisdom, right? So we talked earlier in one of the panels about the majority, but in fact the great strength of the American Constitution is to protect the minority from the whim of the majority. And for me, if I think about openness in political systems, maybe what I do is borrow from Adlai Stevenson, who said that in fact safety for an individual is the ability to be unpopular. And I would expand that to say it's the safety to have a sense of belonging and to have agency. Now, the extent to how much agency one has, the extent to one's self-actualization, I think, again, reasonable people can differ. Asian societies like to say that, it's Confucian and it's filial. But I have to say that in my experience teaching Chinese students and in my experience teaching in the US, that the greatest and most fundamental difference is the sense of agency. The idea that one can determine one's own future and make a difference in the world's future and make it a better place. So I am extraordinarily moved by the words of Agnes and Joshua and their commitment to those ideals. They may look different in China, but I think that if you look at economic growth, that the greatest danger is in fact the inability of people to be able to self-actualize. And the reason I went to Xnode is because I think that in the startup community you find a number of very young entrepreneurs, including my friend Daisy, who'll speak on the next panel, who have a commitment to change things for the better in China. But I think that those things are not entirely synced up.
So could I just draw you out a bit on your very interesting comments on self-actualizing? I mean, is your sense then that that agency, that individual agency, then leads to, it allows society to change from the bottom up, the whole of society, not just individuals? Is that part of it, as you see it?
I think that's fundamental to how we educate our students in the West, and I think it's fundamental to a lot of the liberal values that The Economist espouses. I think it starts very much, and it's very much in our DNA. And by that, I should also say that those statements do not preclude, and I think I feel very strongly, that democracy itself needs to evolve. The American experiment, by Chinese standards, is young. It's only 300 years. So there's much that we can learn and much that we can change. And the Chinese government has done two things that I think we need to learn in the West. One, they have been willing to learn from every system and in every place. They send delegates of people out to every part of the world. They come back, they learn, they think, they absorb, and they change. And the other thing that they're willing to do is to experiment endlessly and iterate at every level. And we have been far too fearful of change in our democratic system to accommodate the change in technology, I think, to preserve our democratic values.
Of course, you've talked about America's great strengths, including the strength of the Constitution. In this part of the world, one of its great strengths to many people would be that it upheld various very important institutions, broadly called the sort of, the international rules-based order, to which people could aspire to. Not only that, but of course it structured relations among states in this part of the world and by and large underpinned prosperity and peace. Now that's not a competing model anymore under President Donald Trump. So that also leaves China in the eyes of some as the sort of ideas victor because it's delivering on economic growth and because America no longer seems to espouse under Trump some of the values it once did. Sharon, I'd love to ask you to jump in here.
Yes, thank you. Much to jump in on, and it is the 175th birthday of The Economist. It's also the 70th birthday of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights this year, so happy birthday to both of all of us. I think that I wanted to say something about the question you raised, like that you had gotten it wrong, that this economic growth was going to lead to a kind of liberalization. That debate was also held internally in China, as you know, and the liberals within the Communist Party lost. And I think they're actually, even Xi Jinping is seeing, maybe they were wrong, that you can't bifurcate political reform from economic reform if you want the economic growth to be sustainable. And I think that's what they're coming up against. So I think it may not be publicly in their assertions of economic progress and success, but it's definitely an internal debate that is continuing, that you can't keep this up. And the slowing of the economy, which is contributing to the vulnerability of Xi Jinping, has to be addressed. And I think a lot of the slowing up, that economic growth, we're not looking at it critically enough and close enough. I mean, how big is the growth? How fast is it really? Have the intergenerational costs, have the costs been externalized to the environment, to people's health, to corruption? I mean, how much is the growth really successful? I absolutely agree that there's been growth, but at what cost and who paid and what paid in terms of the economy?
Well, there's a sense that some of these questions seep in even at an economic or financial level into Hong Kong, which has just entered bear market territory in the stock market. And one of the possibilities, of course, is the solvency of Chinese financial institutions juggling loans, having to add more and more non-performing loans to their portfolios. So economic questions really are to the fore. The question about politics that puzzles me is why it has become more closed than it once was. My colleague, our current China editor, reported from China in the 1980s, and then certainly at least once a year, but usually more often, you could go up at the end of the MPC session and talk to the standing committee members, those 7 men well, greying men, but with black dyed hair, who ran a country of 1 billion people. When I was reporting from China in the mid-90s, mid-level officials would agree with our outside notions about liberalizing China. They'd say, when we assume greater power, don't worry, it's going to liberalize. In the last 10 years, there's been much less political discourse spilling out of what is a very secretive system, and it's having effects on the system, in my view. I mean, for instance, we find it as journalists very, very hard to speak to analysts, to scholars, to people at CAS, the Academy of Social Sciences. They themselves are frightened to speak to foreigners, even outside, because of the surveillance cameras everywhere looking at us. So I just wonder, is there any cost to this closing of the system? And if anyone can throw light on why it's happening, particularly under Xi Jinping, I'd be very grateful. Daniel.
Well, I think, of course, it's happening to a certain extent, but there are lots of counter trends, right? Like within university systems, there are lots of colleges and universities that are actually much more open than before. I could describe my own Shandong University. I could describe Schwarzman College at Tsinghua University. But anyway, to answer the big question, I think there are two main reasons. One is the anti-corruption drive, which has been relatively successful, actually, which really was an existential threat to the system because corruption was so bad and they had to go after it hard. But the problem is it created so many enemies that generates a lot of paranoia in the system. The other reason, I think, is, to be frank, especially the current American government, which is really out to destroy the government and the whole political system. I mean, there are many members. It's a far right-wing government, and their aim is to do to China what they did to the Soviet Union. They want to destroy it. So naturally, people in China are mobilizing against that, and it's not in a current mood to be open when you're faced with this enemy who's out to destroy you. I can fully understand that.
Can I jump in on that?
Yes.
Yeah. I think I have to really disagree with Daniel, because I think there's a sense when I hear you say that, it's the danger of uncritically repeating the official Chinese narrative. That is, the West is out to get them. The West is going to keep them down.
The U.S. administration.
And on the U.S. administration, well, before I say that, I want to just say very quickly, you said before that people don't agree on human rights. We've been saying it previous panels. I have to really correct that. There is universal consensus on what are human rights. They are changing, they are changing, and that's exactly right. China has signed on to every single, and ratified every major treaty on rights of children, rights of women, rights of persons with disabilities, against racial discrimination, and economic, social, cultural rights, and actually has signed the ICCPR. And as a signatory, though they haven't ratified over the last 10 years, they're really compelled to abide by it, of which they accept. So one thing I think is important is that China wants it both ways. On the one hand, they're saying every country has, sovereignty and must determine their own model, their own system. On the other hand, and then they show that they're a good player. On the other hand, they are actively working to replace the current international universal system by standards, by language, by mechanisms, very systematic, sophisticated, long game, short game strategies to undermine and destroy the effectiveness of the current international human rights system. And that system is not static. That system is evolving. But until the time that the whole system collapses, China is bound by the system that it has ratified and joined. It can't, like at the WTO, they join the WTO, but you don't hear them saying, I'm sorry, we joined the WTO, but the main transparency, non-discrimination norms, we don't buy that. They don't do that. They don't say, you have a dispute with me, the US, we refuse to show up at the International Arbitration Panel. They show up. So I think that's a double standard when it deals with trade disputes and with disagreements about their compliance with human rights standards. And the key about human rights standards is they don't get to unilaterally declare the standard and that they have complied with information and evidence that's questionable, with no meaningful indicators, benchmarks, information. So I think that's what's happening, and that game has to be called. That has to be a no BS call, that you can't do that anymore.
So,
thank you.
I will disagree a little bit with that. I mean, I think that in China, whenever you want to give an explanation for something as complicated as the recent tightening, it's not a either or, it's an and or. So certainly the anti-corruption drive is a big part of it. There are certainly factions who believe that the United States is out to destroy it. I think that's a smaller piece of it. I do think that it's also, for the first term of Xi Jinping, it was also power consolidation. I don't think you can discount the fact that China's a large, diverse country with many voices, and inside the party there are many diverse voices. So it was partly his bid to consolidate his power. And I don't think it's actually to the benefit of the country. I think that freedom of speech, as we define it in the United States, is a very far extreme. And as Steve Pinker once said, it is difficult, it's hard work, it's complicated, but it's worth it. And we'll see if it's really going to work in the United States. And I'm not saying that's the right model for China, but I don't believe that universities are more open. I really have to vehemently disagree with that. There's no standard by which the universities in China are more open than they were 5 years ago. And I say that with great respect for all of my colleagues, for all the opportunities that I had, but there are no faculty members or students that I know of in China who believe that it's more open than it was 10 years ago. I studied at Beida in 1983 with some now very prominent scholars, and when we look back now, we realize that 1983 was an extraordinary time to be in China because it was open, it was interested in learning, and you could really talk about anything that you wanted to. But I don't think it's more open, and I think actually that will, in the end, I think that the panel that wants to talk about whether China tech and innovation will ultimately crush the West, this is a place where China will suffer as a result. So I do think innovation does require a certain level of openness, and I think China's trying to find that balance. I think the reason Silicon Valley happened, it wasn't an accident, it happened in the United States.
Well, just, yes, very quick responses from Daniel and Sharon. And of course, academic openness is a big issue here in Hong Kong, of course, as well.
Right. No, so first, I mean, I'd like to disagree with myself, too. No, seriously.
Oh, no, you don't get off that easy.
Okay.
I'm sorry. That
doesn't
doesn't work.
That is pure
That's an admirable
We applaud.
No, I mean, there are many factors besides the two that I named that explain the tightening atmosphere, including the ones that you just named. But in terms of academic openness, I mean, there's so many counterexamples. I mean, Schwarzman College at Tsinghua University, it's much more, they call it a special educational zone. I don't want to go into details, but it's much more open than any place I've taught in Tsinghua before. Shandong University, where I am now, the further you are from Beijing, the less you feel the political pressure, you know, and we you know, I don't
Okay,
face...
that's not a model for institutional governance. That's actually simply a real example and reflection of the lack of governance and institution in China. The further, I mean, that is in fact the very metaphor for what the problem is in China, which is it's a function of who you are and where you are and not the institution itself, right? Absolutely. That's actually the core of this discussion, and it is the one that I struggle most deeply with inside of China. I mean, what you said is absolutely right. I'm sure that's true.
Right. Well, I don't know. Just one. Maybe can I disagree a little bit with Sharon? I mean, I disagree. I agree with almost all what you said. Just one thing about the Universal Declaration. At the level of principle, I'd like to know what China, of course, opposes one person, one vote. The rest, where does it oppose in principle? I mean, maybe.
Oh, are you saying what my reference
No,
to?
it's
It's not opposition. I'll give you the three.
At the level of principle.
Yeah, they're saying there's no such thing. Wait, there's no such thing as universal human rights. They say what we are saying is there's human rights with Chinese characteristics, which basically means no rights, except for what they give you. The second thing they've said is there's no such thing right now as development. They have rejected development to be sustainable must be within a rights-based framework, which is widely accepted. And they're saying development is not within a rights-based framework. Thirdly, they're saying no rule of law. So people aren't listening when they say China's going to eventually open. They're telling you we're not going to open. They're saying we're going to rule the country, not 法治, 依法治国. We're going to rule, govern by, I was corrected by a government official. They said, 依法治国 is not ruled by law, it's governing by law. I go, okay, governing by law, right? So they're saying very clearly that the key pillars you need for a market to function, access to information, a functioning rule of law, independent courts and judicial decision-making, they're telling you straight up, not in China. And not just telling the outside world, through the ideological campaigns, through the policy, very clear policies that says judges, lawyers, procurates, the media, and academics must now undergo ideological education, which is about Xi Jinping thought, who is now being raised to divine-like status. So I think to say there are trends, and the trends are extremely disturbing, and the long arm, not so long arm, of Beijing is reaching right here into Hong Kong. And I think Joshua Wong can attest to the efforts to introduce ideological education in Hong Kong was not so long ago. So the danger of saying, in my experience teaching, it was open, or in my classroom, it's the danger of arguing what do they call it? Competing empirics, like my experience versus your experience. The thing to look at is not your experience versus my experience, because when I taught law in Beijing in 1986, trust me, I had the experience, it was open, I was very excited, my law students were very excited, the 86th democracy, that's not the base. The base is show us the data, right? And with respect to if education is so great in China, I'm very disturbed by statistics recently that more than half of Chinese millionaires are thinking of moving abroad. That was this year. The flight of capital continues, and exiles, the elites, the political elites, in all of the surveys, 83% are planning on sending their children abroad to be educated. And a lot of that also includes not abroad, but crossing the border into Hong Kong. Why? Because the mainlanders who study in Hong Kong believe and have said the values, the openness, the greater openness in Hong Kong is why they're here, because of the values that Hong Kong stands for and the space here. That's why we have to support you, young people, next generation. Yeah, because they're the ones who are going to keep it open.
Thank you. I'm now going to open it up to the floor, but I would like to raise one theme that we haven't touched on, just to zoom out a bit, but it does speak to issues that you've all raised. Daniel, you've criticized American power. May and Sharon, you've criticized Chinese power. And one of our concerns at The Economist is that with the US no longer really backing it, in fact, in some ways under Trump, trying to dismantle an international rules-based order in this system, it's now a geopolitics which increasingly looks to be driven by power. I wonder what other countries in the region think if it's all about sphere of influence and balance of power. And that is something I would love to hear from the floor about. In fact, Danny Kwa, maybe if you could speak to this as a representative of a small country in Southeast Asia. Your own Lee Kuan Yew school last year expelled an academic for being an agent of Chinese influence. I'm sure that you don't want to choose between America and China, but is this increasingly becoming a part of the world which is going to be driven by balance of power, by spheres of influences and all the struggles that flow from that? Could you maybe speak to that first, and then we're absolutely open to questions from the floor.
Certainly. Thank you. Thank you. What an amazing panel. Congratulations to all of you. On the point that you raised, if I may, to be very clear, the expulsion of the academic Wang Jing did not name where he was an agent of influence from. He was a foreign agent of influence. And just to be clear, he carried an American passport, and obviously he had come originally from China.
He didn't have American security clearance.
But there was no...
When he wanted to join the Trump administration.
Okay. But in
he's now
case,
teaching in China and Sichuan, right?
But the first place that he went after he left Singapore was the United States. In any case, there's a whole story there to unpack, which we can do at some other point.
A testament to U.S. openness.
Your question on the new order that we might be moving into. I think all of us have benefited from the order that America constructed. The liberal, rules-based, multilateral, transparent, inclusive order that allowed all of us to be prosperous. And that was a wonderful time to be alive. America has pulled back from it. I think there's no question about that. There's no way to convince America that it is a good thing. So the rest of us are floundering. And Singapore and many other small states have benefited hugely from the way in which a rule of international law allowed all of us to assert our identity and foreign policy. That's something that all of us hugely value. It's an open question where we go to from here. But while I personally would lament how America has exited the stage there, we probably do not want to romanticize America's presence in that order. That world order is something that everybody benefited from. And if we need to do without US presence, the rest of us will just have to pitch in and make a new world order from it. And I think that's not impossible.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Danny. Michael, is that Michael's hand up? You've had one already, so you'll just have to wait. Yes, you, sir, there.
Thank you. Jeffrey Black's my name. About the international economic and legal order that we've been debating for the past half an hour or so, should that order change and compromise in order to accommodate the legitimate rise of China and its economic might? Or should the guardians of that economic order actively resist an increasingly illiberal China?
Thank you. So yes, I mean there was a talk at one point of China being a responsible stakeholder. That you don't hear that much more anymore. Who would like to answer the
I'm not sure about that. I mean, on issues like climate change, China is leading the pack, far ahead of the US, and they're dealing with state governments like California that are much more willing to deal with these global issues. They have a stake in the world in a way that wasn't true. I mean, the one time that I did assist a meeting with President Xi Jinping where he gave a speech was, and then he said, it was about, he invited many political parties from around the world. There were like 300 political parties. And then there was one moment where he said, there's lots of people maybe who say that we should escape the world and go to another planet. And he says, no, this world is our world. We're going to fight for this world. It's a much more global vision, and it's rooted in much more traditional ideas of Tianxia, than the US now. They view the US as like a company that competes against other companies, each for their own interest. China, we can criticize them, but at least they have a much more global vision in other countries. It's both communist and Confucian. Sorry if I sound a bit polemical.
Thank you.
So, I think we should defend Chinese Americans.
Well,
I have to say.
what I would say is that the Chinese government over the last 30 years has been ruthlessly strategic in its selection of where it wishes to benefit from the world order and where it doesn't. So I think the answer to your question is, I think, and I would say, gosh, I really don't want to spend any more time defending the United States because I really didn't vote for that guy, but I am American. So I just have to say that he's only in office for 4 years, and we're working very hard to make sure that it's only 4 years, but it could be longer.
Maybe not.
I'm hoping that the liberal world order can stand up for itself while America waffles around trying to figure out what to do. But I do think that the world order should stand up and, in fact, say to China, if you're part of the WTO, you need to be an open market. And while I disagree with the idea of a tariff war, I think that the American administrations long ago should have said to China, your markets need to be open and you need to uphold to the promises that you said. I think that was a mistake on the part of all of the institutions. And now I think it's late because they have become a mighty power. And the power of their scale is very difficult to counter by anybody.
A very quick response, Sharon, because I'm keen that we have more questions.
That is the very important question of should the international existing order accommodate. And I think every order should accommodate the different stakeholders. But in terms of the international human rights legal order, the other stakeholders that are critical in that system are civil society organizations, and that includes the private sector, it includes multinationals. They all have a role to play, and I think that's what China is actively working to undermine and subvert. They're trying to limit through rules and procedural games, which they're really good at. They're running circles around the Western European governments and the Western democracies, is that they're trying to cut the role and the space for the other stakeholders and using pressure and influence. That's why you see the whole lineup of companies that can't apologize fast enough to China for having insulted China or hurt the feelings of the Chinese people across every sector. So I think the key answer to that question is, who gets to answer that question? Should it? Who gets to be part of the debate? And it can't just be states, and it can't just be governments. And I have to say, as a Chinese American, a Hong Konger, I'm a born Hong Konger, is that Trump does not and cannot in these debates be equated with America. He was elected by not the majority of the American people. He is the president due to an anarchic, historical electoral college. And frankly, you can't ignore what American people are doing now, the pushback. So let's wait till November, the midterm election, and then we can have a discussion again about what America represents. And I think we're still claiming multilateralism, international standards, human dignity.
All right. And I'm sure our New York session later this day will also be arguing these things. Gentleman at the front here, please.
Okay, so my question is for Daniel, and I promise I'm not coordinating with your colleagues, we're not attacking you. But you spoke about the sense of political diversity in China. You also spoke about how China has or rather we should grant China the need to sort of realize its own political system, and that should not necessarily be modeled on the West. You also, for example, cited The Economist as being too rigid on its stance with respect to certain issues. My question for you is, firstly, how does diversity exist without tolerance and inclusion? Because diversity cannot exist if you're not willing to engage everyone across the spectrum. Diversity cannot be selective. You cannot tell people, I'll be diverse and I'll be inclusive, provided you agree with my values and you agree with where I come from. And secondly, you also spoke, I mean, given the nature of your work, I assume you've read the Chinese constitution, I assume you've read the nature of their laws. Laws don't get more supreme. They have one of the most supreme constitutions in the world. They have one of the most, quote unquote, black and white constitutions in the world. It's either you fit in and you conform to those communist values or you don't. And the repercussions are real. How does diversity coexist with that? And could you go as far, if you're willing to do so, as defining what diversity is in that context and at what cost we achieve that diversity?
Thank you for the lovely question. We have 18 seconds left.
Well, you have about a minute to summarize Confucianism and diversity in China. And then, otherwise we risk hurting the feelings of the next panel.
I mean, it's a lovely question and very, very difficult to answer. But just one little thing, I mean, when we say the Chinese Communist Party, you know, the word communism sounds very narrow and intolerant, but in fact it encompasses a whole range of diverse values. I mean, where I used to teach at Tsinghua University, you know, many of my colleagues were communist members, but some of them were Confucians, you know, Taoists, Buddhists, liberals. I mean, and it's a very wide spectrum, and we shouldn't think that being a Communist Party member in China means that you're rigidly attached to certain ideologies. It's just one thing to say. Now, the basic idea, I think, motivating principle that about diversity in China is, you know, if you do, so long as you don't advocate violence in terms of your religion or overthrowing the whole political system, there's tremendous amount of respect for diversity in China. I mean, just go to the different cities in China are so diverse. Hong Kong, you know, Qufu, the home of Confucianism, Beijing, Shanghai, incredibly diverse in terms of what people argue about. So, I mean, beyond these obvious restrictions, I think there's much more diversity than seems often reported. I don't want to sound polemical in the Western press, but the Economist is an exception. The Economist is beautiful.
We're out of time. We've started a whole stream of conversations. Okay. Let's continue them after the formal sessions in the next room. But I hope you'll all agree this has been a really stimulating session. And will you please join me in thanking my panelists, Daniel, May, and Sharon. Thank you so much. Now back to Robert and the future of the media.
Thank you very much, Dominic. I'd like to invite on the stage Keith Richberg, who runs the Mr. Richberg, who runs the Journalism Centre at the University of Hong Kong, and we should have a link up with Chris Patton as well. Keith, have a seat. Lovely to see you. And looks like we've got Chris Patton on the line. Mr. Patton, can you hear us?
I can indeed, and I can see you as well, and see my old friend Keith.
Excellent. Well, these two need no introduction, but I'm going to introduce them anyway. Chris Patton is the Chancellor of Oxford University, a former chairman of the BBC, and may be slightly known to some people here as the former governor of Hong Kong.
Colloquial presser.
You're very welcome. Keith Richberg is the author of a fantastic book about Africa called Out of America, A Black Man Confronts Africa, which is very relevant to the debate that we're having today in different parts of the world, because it's an incredibly well-reported, very elegant plea for people to treat people in other countries on their own terms and not to see politics, not to see everything through the prism of your own domestic politics. One of the many arguments that he was making is that Africa is not an extension of American race relations politics. It was an absolutely cracking book, one of the first things I read before going to Africa, and it was superb. So, what we're going to talk about today is the future of the media in Asia. Is it one of vibrancy and diversity and truthfulness and originality? Or is it more like what we've just seen in Myanmar, where 2 Reuters journalists have been put in prison by a government that's supposedly led by a former Nobel Peace Prize laureate for the crime of supposedly publishing state secrets? These state secrets were documents that were A, given to them by policemen in a sting operation, and B, were already public. Nonetheless, they're going to prison for a very long time. Mr. Richberg, I will start with you. What, from your vantage point here in Hong Kong, how optimistic or pessimistic are you about the future of media in Asia?
Well, it's a great question, because if you really think about it, it's really kind of one of these glass half full or is it half empty. You mentioned the Reuters correspondents who were imprisoned, I think, for 7 years. If you look at Cambodia, where Hun Sen has basically shut down all the independent media and cowed the rest. You look at Thailand, where basically they're getting ready for an election and the junta has closed the media. Just look around the region, and Southeast Asia, especially in Asia, is on all the maps that show press freedom, Southeast Asia is this big red blot. And then, of course, China, of course, has what minimal freedoms there were seem to have been rolled back from the time I was there. On the other hand, one thing that does make me more optimistic is the fact that because of the new websites that are showing up and the new citizen journalists, the barrier to entry for media is lower than it's before. Anyone can start a new website and start a discussion out there. And you look around and you look at Malaysia Kini, the new website in Malaysia that helped bring down the government there, in the elections. You look at Mizima in Myanmar, which is doing great things. You look at in Korea, this Korean Investigative Journalist Center, KCIJ, is doing some great things as well. So I think the explosive growth of new media is helping, I think, bypass the censored old media in a lot of ways. That gives a lot of hope. And, I run a journalism program now at the University of Hong Kong, and we have no trouble attracting students from mainland China and from around the region. And one thing that gives me hope is that people are still interested in going into journalism. They're not cowed by all the negative news out there and cowed by people calling it fake news and saying the industry is dying. They want to get out there. They want to get involved. They have this empathy. They want to tell stories. So that gives me optimism.
That's very encouraging. And I have to say, I think that is true. I mean, we still routinely get more than 1,000 applicants for one internship. People want to do this because they realize that it's, it matters and it's quite fun. Mr. Patton, you've chaired one of the largest media organizations in the world, and you've also seen a big transition in Hong Kong. How do you, what's your take on the future of media, specifically in China, Greater China, in Hong Kong and China?
Well, you started off by referring to it in the context of Asia. Of course, it depends where you mean in Asia. India, Japan, particularly India, you'd think there was a really vital press and more people reading newspapers every day and watching huge amounts of television, not just cricket. So it depends where you're talking about in Asia. Secondly, I think it's important to recognize, too, that this subject is very closely related to what you've just been talking about. And I think the future and the vitality of open society, of sustainable society, is very much part of the argument about the media. Now, the points that Keith was just making about particular organizations, you could have gone on and referred to, for example, the Hong Kong Free Press, which is how I get most of my information, apart from friends, about what's happening in Hong Kong now, crowd-funded, like other organizations around the region, and playing a really important role, because we all know that an open press, that open discussion, that knowledge, that memory is very important to good government. What criticism does is to help reduce corruption. It helps to make the decisions which governments make better. And I don't think that's going to go away. I don't think it's going to be eliminated by oppressive, depressive government. I don't think that's going to happen in China. I don't think it's going to long term, I don't think it's going to happen anywhere else.
Any moment, I'm going to throw it open to the audience, so be prepared for questions. I think, but before we do, I want to put one more question to Mr. Patton. To what degree do you think the difficulty of reporting honestly and truthfully and accurately on things that are going on in China makes it harder for China to retain its extraordinary growth rates of the past few decades?
Well, the first thing to say is that, as I think what people were suggesting in the last conversation, President Trump has been a huge help to those with dictatorial, autocratic tendencies in China. I mean, President Xi Jinping must regard President Trump as the gift that goes on giving. But he's not going to be giving forever. And there will come a moment, pray God, before too long, when there is a more sensible administration in America, which understands the importance of the soft power, not particularly of America, but of some of the ideas which were associated not just with America, but with lots of countries in Asia, including India, including Japan, and lots of countries elsewhere around the world. Because we're talking about rights which are universal, not just related to one civilization or another. So I do think that in China, for example, as a point made regularly in the novels of Mark Jan, memory, knowledge about what has happened and what is happening is a very important part of building the bridges in society, of building the possibilities for consent when things go wrong. If you're at the top of a structure, if you're in effect operating dictatorial, whatever happens to the digital world, sooner or later you'll get something wrong. And you're more likely to get, there's nobody criticizing or telling how things could be done better. And I think one of the important roles that newspapers play, and we see it happening in the United States at the moment with media organizations, one of the important roles they play is to make governance more sustainable and higher quality. And if you don't understand that, you don't understand anything about long-term relationship between open economics, which I think is fundamental.
Do we have any questions in the audience? Yes, there's one there and one there. This is a new one. So is that someone who's asked before? I can't quite. Yep, that one and then that one, please. So I can't.
Hi, Keith. We're talking about aspects of social media here. Okay. I'm quoting something that was written by Tom Friedman. Right. He mentioned that in this current age of digital acceleration, right, we've never been godlike before. Right. That means the power of one. What the power of single touch can do on social media. So my question is, how do we manage accountability on social media?
How do you manage accountability on social media? Well, you know, one of the problems with social media is that there is often no accountability, and that's why I believe you're starting to see even the United States trying to put up some controls, but saying things like taking down fake accounts, etc. You know, I think some of the countries in Asia have gone too far in trying to basically criminalize false information or rumors going around on social media. China obviously went the furthest, starting years ago when they started to jail people for putting around fake news. I was in China in 2012 when there were rumors of a coup in Beijing that were circulated on Weibo, Sina Weibo, and I think that actually started what was then a crackdown on the Weibo system in China, which up until then, I was in China from 2009 until 2013, and I think that was a remarkable open period in China where everything was being discussed. But a couple of things happened in 2011 and 2012, the Arab Spring, happened. The Bo Xilai case, which was kind of tumbled out through post-social media. Chen Guangchang escaped from his illegal house arrest and made his way to the U.S. Embassy, and we learned about this on social media. All of these things happened, and then you had a train crash that happened outside of Shanghai, and that even though they tried to suppress reporting of it, it all tumbled out via social media. So I think the Chinese learned that this was social media was something that was unaccountable and had to be controlled. And I think you started to see other authoritarian governments around the world follow that example and try to control it. I think one thing, not to take up too much time with this, but it's such an interesting question. One thing I think that's really interesting now is that because of all the so-called fake news or disinformation or hoax news floating around out there, you're starting to see a little bit of a swing back to the legacy media. And as Governor Patton mentioned, that the media in the United States, look at the fantastic work that the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal are doing, uncovering a lot of the shenanigans, shall we say, of the Trump administration, and not just involving the Russia investigation, but involving the EPA and involving some of these cabinet secretaries who have been caught out. So it's just really great reporting. We're actually seeing a real newspaper war going on in the United States, and I think people are actually starting to realize that, as you mentioned, there's no accountability when people just post something on social media, so they're actually gravitating back to the legacy media, and I would think The Economist as well.
Great. Question over there. Can we get a microphone down there, please? Oh, okay. Well, if you're ceding it, there was a question over at the back, I believe. Yeah, okay, no, there's one there.
I would like to address this question to Lord Patton now. In terms of freedom of speech, I think most of us would agree that the freedom of speech in Hong Kong is being eroded. So on this aspect, do you think the British government can do anything to counter this? Because it's against the Sino-British Joint Declaration. It's very clear. So Lord Patton, do you think there's anything that the international community, especially the British government, can do that to counter the influence of the Beijing government on Hong Kong? Thanks.
I think there's a difference here between can and should. I think the British government should do more about it. I think they should say more. I think they've been a bit more explicit in the last year or two about what are plainly breaches or undermining of the Joint Declaration and the promises that were made in that by China as well as the United Kingdom. But I think they should be, like the rest of the international community, more outspoken. The trouble is that for a lot of the outside community now, attitudes to China, as the former Australian Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, and there are quite a few former Australian Prime Ministers these days, once said the attitude of the world outside China is one which is a balance of fear and greed. And I think that brings out the worst in China, and that we should all be more robust in what we say about what's going on in China. So when it comes back to your remarks about reporting earlier, we shouldn't agree only to report in China what the Chinese want us to hear or say. It's extraordinary how difficult any journalist would find it to get to Tibet now or into Xinjiang. But there are still some great reporters, not just working for the legacy institute that Keith was talking about, having been associated with for some years, the BBC. I think there is a very strong case these days for more public service broadcasting rather than for undermining public service. On Hong Kong, every organization we take seriously regard freedom of speech as having been constrained from. And I think that's bad for Hong Kong's international reputation. And I think it makes it difficult for Hong Kong to continue on the extraordinary successful flight path which it's enjoyed for many years. So I hope the many very robust journalists in Hong Kong will continue to have the opportunity to tell Hong Kongers and the world outside, actually, in the city.
We've probably got time for one more question. So, yes, sir. We can get a microphone there. Post haste, please. Probably best not to throw it, although I believe in the other one we have a phone microphone that you can throw.
Yes, so building upon this gentleman's question here, was the joint declaration actually almost a mistake due to its lack of enforceability by the international community? And would there be anything we could do to correct this from this point?
Okay, that's not hugely media-y, but perhaps you'd like to address it anyway.
Well, I don't think the joint declaration was a mistake. I think it was a brilliant attempt to provide a bridge between Britain and China on an issue which they both found acutely embarrassing. For both Britain and China, the way in which Hong Kong had become a British colony represented a humiliating period in Chinese history, and what should, in retrospect, be regarded as rather a humiliating set of actions by Britain in the 19th century. But there were two other embarrassments. One was that Chinese communists must have noticed that more than half the population in Hong Kong were refugees from communism in China, crawled over barbed wire or swum through dangerous waters in order to get this outpost of the British Empire and build a wonderful life for themselves there. But it was also difficult and embarrassing for Britain because we were never in a position, which, unlike our other colonies, we could prepare a colony for independence and democracy. That was never going to happen. So I think one country, two systems mantra managed to provide a way, a shape for the handover and for developing policy. I think the real problem would be that I don't think that many Chinese officials have ever tried hard enough to understand what Hong Kong's system is. We're not talking about one country, 1 3/4 system, or one country, 1 1/2 systems. Then one country, we're talking about one country. And an important part of Hong Kong has always been open discussion, open inquiry, universities which are autonomous and can research anything with the law, freedom of association, freedom of religion. All those things are part of what made Hong Kong one of the open and free societies in Asia, more than just the richest city in China, a really important bastion of freedom around the world. And I hope that is done by chipping away at the role of the press in Hong Kong.
Keith, the last word of this panel goes to you. Perhaps you'd like to say something about how you see freedom of expression in Hong Kong.
Absolutely. I will just follow up on that. And, there was an earlier question that referred to the rollback of press freedom here in Hong Kong. And I would just push back on that a little bit. Yeah, yes, we've seen that. I've seen the reports from the Hong Kong Journalists Federation and others. But I would have to just push back and say, it's still the freest press in China. And I'm assuming we don't count Taiwan here for a moment. And the fact that a lot of people...
That's something you're not allowed to say everywhere.
I may have to apologize to it. But, and also if you look at it, we're still here. I'm still here running a journalism program. AP, Reuters, AFP, BBC, they all have bureaus here. So as long as we stay here, it means that we still have confidence that we can do our job here. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen forever, and we'll have to see what happens over the next 20 years. But for the first 20 years, we have seen that, despite some rollback and despite some what I consider more self-censorship than censorship by the mainland, we can still operate here, and we can freely have this debate here on this stage and invite Joshua Wong in here and do this. So, hopefully this can continue. Hopefully, the people of Hong Kong can continue to push back and get back to preserve their own freedoms.
Super. That's all we have time for on this panel, so I hope you will join me in giving a very warm round of applause to our two outstanding speakers, Keith Richburg and Chris Patton.
Thank you, Reverend Patton.
Thank you very much for joining us, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Governor.
Can I just recommend, as you did, Keith Richburg's book?
Great plug.
That's 2 out of 2 people recommending it. There you go. It really is good. I mean, it's called Out of America, and it's available from Amazon and all good bookshops. I am going to do a slightly unscheduled thing here. It's not on the program, but I would like to welcome briefly onto the stage 2 of the winners of our Open Future Essay Contest, which was open to young people grappling with the big issues of our time. So if we could have Julia Simons and Denzel Chung come up onto the stage right now, please. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. So these 2 were among the many, many people who entered our contest, and they each came up with a really fantastically well-written and mature essay, which I think you can find on the app, or at least at the end of your program. So if I could start with Julia, you wrote an essay on the question of, has political correctness gone too far? And you concluded that it had not. How did you reach that conclusion?
Yeah, it's a tough question, and I do think that a lot of cases of perhaps censorship sometimes do go too far, but what I ultimately argued was that generally the people who invoke the argument of political correctness gone too far are doing it largely to cover up illiberal values. And so I was going from the starting point of what is the right thing as far as preserving open societies and liberal values. And one of the examples I used, I'm from Australia originally, and during our country's same-sex plebiscite last year on same-sex marriage, the former Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, the second time he's been name-checked, who was a very ardent campaigner against same-sex marriage, made a statement along the lines of, if you oppose political correctness, vote no to same-sex marriage. So for him, opposing political correctness was synonymous with depriving a minority of the right to marry and all of the rights that that engenders. And that's just one example, I think, of how often people who do talk about political correctness often have quite shady motivations. But that's not to say that we should welcome all forms of censorship or indeed all aspects of political correctness culture. I mean, I'm still grappling with these issues all the time, so.
No, it was a very good essay because you dealt with both sides of the argument, and it wasn't a rant, it was a very sort of considered analysis of the issues, which I thought demonstrated wisdom beyond your years. Sorry, Miranda's been making fun of people's ages earlier, so it goes both ways. Denzel.
Yes.
You wrote a terrific essay on drawing on your experiences as someone who'd moved from Kuala Lumpur to New Zealand,
yes.
And you were asking the question about tolerance, and you argued that tolerance is not good enough, that we need to move beyond that to acceptance. Can you explain to the audience briefly what you mean by that?
Thank you. Right. Well, briefly, what I basically explored, well, the way I see it is that, the world is, the idea of, large-scale immigration is really a relatively new idea in the world. And for a lot of communities around the world, they're basically experiencing what it's like to have, different sorts of cultures. Like foreign cultures actually enter the mainstream for, the first time for a lot of places around the world. And so the way I see the status quo today is we've reached kind of a stage of tolerance, essentially, where, we have broadly in the mainstream recognized that immigrants, they are necessary, for society function. They can even be beneficial, in terms of strictly economic, in terms of filling, skilled labor, labor shortages. Like my father was an engineer, and that's how he managed to move to New Zealand. But I think that, to be satisfied at this point is it's not enough, and it can be a bit dangerous because a tolerance, as my essay argues, it doesn't necessarily mean acceptance. It basically means that, and if we stay comfortable with simply tolerating immigrants, what we risk doing is that we hide away all the misunderstandings and the misconceptions, and we hide it behind a veneer of, we need you here, but, we may not like you, but we will tolerate you and we will just leave you in the corner here because we need you here. And I think that in the long term, that can be incredibly damaging and dangerous to society.
Thank you very much. Well, thinking of acceptance, I was wondering if you might accept a small token of our, a small token of our esteem, and this one is for Denzel. So if I come around here, if you can take that.
Yes.
Thank you very much indeed. Everyone could applaud him. Well done. And we have one more here. This is for Julia. Plaque to take away. I don't know if it fits in hand luggage, but it certainly make a good umbrella if the weather turns nasty. Thank you very much, and well done. Thank you very much. Thank you. So now I will invite Miranda back on the stage to talk about whether China is eating our technological lunch.
Thanks, Robert. Please can I welcome onto the stage my fabulous guests for this last panel. I have Benjamin Hu, who's a partner at the law firm Loeb & Loeb. I have Daisy Guo, who is the co-founder of Design, which is a data intelligence solutions platform. Edith Young, who's a partner at 500 Startups, which is a venture capital fund. I was going to say a capital venture fund, but no. Thank you so much for joining me. So I was quite excited when I found out that I was going to be hosting this panel. You know, will China tech crush the West? And then sort of thinking about it again, I wondered whether this was actually a helpful framing. Is this a good formulation? Is anybody trying to crush anybody? Does technology even work like that? You know, or does it depend on various teams in various countries around the world, you know, working on projects and data to inculcate improvement? So perhaps, you know, casting it out initially to you, Benjamin, you know, is there any crushing going on? Is this a helpful way to think about this competition?
Okay, first of all, I'm not so sure if a technology should be bound by the borders because, for example, 100 years ago, people were excited about the physics revolution. But nowadays, I don't think people will talk about any country owned the physics revolution. So just like today, everyone's excited about artificial intelligence, the AI technology. I don't think a few decades later, people will talk about whether AI mostly came from the US or China or somewhere else. That's my first take. Yeah, maybe the ladies can also chip in on that.
Edith, what do you think?
I personally hate the word crush.
Excellent.
And I think that sometimes it's unfortunate. I always see myself as a technologist, happen to invest. And if you talk to a lot of the geeks and the developers, the last thing they think about is being political. And I don't think just because maybe China has spent a lot of time and resource and energy on developing AI, just because there's more development there doesn't mean that another country will lose. Have nothing to do with it. In fact, I think China, regardless from food safety, pollutions, and just security in general, I think AI, facial recognition, is deployed in many different train stations, is actually we needed that because there's a lot of things that need to solve for the society. So in this case, sometimes it really bothers me the fact that, in the US, which we don't necessarily, I spend half of my time in the States, definitely particularly in California, Mr. President is not like our favorite person these days. So I just don't like the fact that, technology is being put in the centerpiece for politics.
Very interesting. Daisy, are you trying to crush anybody?
No, definitely not. I more like to see some collaborations or learn from the West. I'm born in China and I'm working in China, so I can be the representative. I think that we see lots of opportunities in China, but maybe some Western companies, they don't have the advantages to seek it. Because nowadays you see that in China, we even have a startup called PDD. They are belonging to the ecosystem of WeChat economy that they got IPO. So I think that China, we have lots of innovation happen, but it's not a coincidence because we have lots of support, not only from the policymaker, but also from the talents who have the background in technology. So I more think we are trying to learn the knowledge from the West and also to adapt it into the Chinese market.
And I think, there used to be a narrative that persisted that, China didn't do innovation. China wasn't innovative, and increasingly, that has been proven to be a myth in this day and age. And I was wondering, Edith, if you could sort of overview how did we get here, and how is it that China has managed to through its companies push some of the most exciting innovation, particularly through companies such as Tencent and Alibaba and others. How has this come into being that China is now at the forefront of sort of new technological change?
Yeah, so just to start with, so my background is, I still remember 30 years ago when I go visit my aunt in Beijing. Those are the days still, in order to get food, you need meal ticket. And that's within my lifetime. So if you talk about like 15, 20 years ago, there's definitely a lot of copycat going on. And you can almost sort of say, hey, Baidu is the Google of China, or Weibo is the Twitter of China. And this is so not the case anymore. And in fact, China is the world's first cashless society. Every time I have Chinese friends come and visit San Francisco, they just sort of very dumbfounded the fact that, what, you still need to use cash? In fact, the other way around, if you go visit Beijing or any major cities, no one actually uses cash anymore. So I think China definitely worked really, really hard to get to where we are today. And for sure, by the way, now in terms of academic paper on math and science and physics, Chinese academic actually contribute to 1/3 of these publications now, and in fact, probably more than the US. More or less is multiple things. One is a lot of the entrepreneurs remember the days where they were really, really poor, so they worked really, really hard to get there. It's not only 996, means 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. for 6 days. I actually think it's 7 days a week. A lot of my American colleagues, by the time 7 p.m., they just got to go home, and nobody texts or call anybody after 10 p.m. And that's so not the case in China. China worked really, really hard. Second, I do think that Chinese government are very intentional about helping, want to be the number one in AI. There's a lot of amazing industrial park and incubator, and wanted to train 500,000 AI data scientists and developers. And they're very intentional, inviting a lot of great researcher and R&D and professors to come to China and share with the community. It's just great to see. And that's why China definitely have skipped, I think completely skipped the PC day, and now everybody is on mobile. And that's still so not the case. And I don't think anywhere in the rest of the world are really that intentional about like helping on the technology front.
And sort of Daisy, on Edith's point there, the idea that entrepreneurs in China, they're hungry, they're working beyond 9 till 6, 7 days a week. I mean, I met a professor this week from the Philippines who said it's all well and good to talk about young entrepreneurs and entrepreneurialism, but the ones that she encounters most of the time, she jokes, are COOs. And I said, what do you mean by that? And she said, they're the children of owners. You can only get so far if you've already had a boost up. I mean, Daisy, is that your experience in China? Or if you're a smart young person, you've been to university, you've studied the right things, there is opportunity for you. How do you see it?
For me, when I see the startups in China, I think we still have a long way to go. Because when we see Alibaba, we think it's a global firm, but actually it's a teenager, right? So it's just around 18 years old. And when we think it's a global firm, but actually they didn't practice very well in other countries. So for me, I always see innovation is it's a creativity of a bunch of individuals. So that's why we should think about the organization design. But in that case, I think most of the China startups, we need to learn a lot, because we see the kind of the recent failure of Richard Liu of JD, but we also see the kind of the potential success of Alibaba, like Jack Ma stepping out of the major role of his firm. So I think that in China, if we want to do a real globalization firm, first we have to develop the core technology, and also we have to try to build a professional organization which can reinforce the atmosphere of freedom for every individual inside, can create something. And also we have to respect their time. That's why I don't agree that they need to work too long in the firm, because in my company I truly care about the efficiency. Maybe we are a Shanghainese company, so Shanghainese always is different from Beijingese, right? So we care about the quality of life. That's why that we have lots of healthy startups that are related to gym, related to beauty in the city. So I truly care the health of my staff, and I hope that they can just use the efficiency instead of the long hours in our firm.
So can I call you on Sunday?
Yeah, sure, you can call me, but I am the boss, right? I don't need my staff to just receive my call on Sunday. I always tell them, please rest.
I mean, your mention of an atmosphere of freedom, reminds me of Armei Lee's point in an earlier panel about, potentially a threat to China's innovation is a lack of openness, a difficulty. I mean, Benjamin, you worked on both sides of this.
Right.
How do you see that?
I actually have serious doubt about the long-term vibrancy of China in terms of being an innovative powerhouse, because China, day in, day out, I do a lot of venture financing deals as a lawyer, and from what I see, it strikes me that China is in a unique position to take advantage of several things. One is China is the biggest homogeneous market in the world. While Europe is actually a fake homogeneous market. America is another one, but China is becoming bigger because the middle class keeps accumulating wealth. And like Edith just mentioned, China managed to leapfrog over certain existing technology. We have very advanced digital payments, mobile payments, because we leapfrog over the ubiquitous adoption of credit cards. And in part, the mobile smartphone revolution is also contributing to that kind of leapfrog effect. And the third thing is actually over the years, China has done a lot. This is down to the legal framework, regulatory level. Gotten rid of a lot of the bad habits in terms of the government, how the government is run. I think it was Mark Twain who said something like, if you are an old sick person, it would be good if you're a person with a lot of bad habits. You can start to get rid of some of them and get better. But over the years, China is hitting the point when a lot of the tougher part in the reform need to happen. Last time I talked to some economists, I was told that 80%, 80% of the commercial lending goes to the state-owned companies, which contribute to 1/4 of the economic output. So not so much for innovative, exciting startup like Daisy's company. That's just one of the problems. So when we are talking about crashing, I don't hate that word actually. But it rings something related to military technology. The Mongolian cavalry was a crushing technology, conquering Middle Asia and Eastern Europe. The British gunboats was a crushing technology. American industrial output towards the end of World War II was another one, crushing Japan. I don't see that happening in China yet. I'm too young to know anything, but my late grandfather, he was a lifelong communist government official, but also a passionate expert in Shakespeare. He told me that, you know what, the West has a weapon, which is the optimistic humanism. He thought it's fully embodied in Shakespeare's works, but I would argue that today it's also very much in the higher education and research in the West, which is the gold standard. And that, I would argue, is where the military technology would eventually come from. And as one of the previous panel mentioned, the higher education societies, the institutions in China are not getting more open. So yeah, I'm in a way a little bit pessimistic.
Pessimist, yeah. Edith, do you share such pessimism?
I guess because I did spend a lot of time in this state, so in general, I'm very happy, very positive. I think that, and as you mentioned earlier, in terms of sort of government policy, or is it really that? I think a few things, right? Because what we focus on is technology. And when we think about tech, of course, like I'm in the venture capital side of things, we always sort of think about, is that policy from investments and investment dollar, or is there any policy for just helping startup in general? Could be data related. I think data is a new oil, particularly for AI these days. Is there any exit in terms of M&A or going public? So if I do the comparison between China and US on all these areas, just to start with, for a while in the US, they were trying to pass this law called startup visa to get more foreign entrepreneurs to set up shop and get to stay in the US. That law didn't pass. So US is also sort of not really doing so well in that sense. But having said that, I think China sometimes is also equally hard in that sense. But having said that, there's definitely a lot of government-backed venture funds in China. In US, this doesn't really exist. And on the M&A front, what's been super interesting and unfortunately political, I think both countries have been blocking certain, for example, China actually blocked the Qualcomm and NXP. And the Qualcomm Broadcom in the US. It's very unfortunate. It really shouldn't be that way. But what the trade war is going on, there's another impact, which I think is much longer term, not just immediate, particularly on tariff, the 200 billion tariff, is actually kind of push China in a certain corner. If this the ZTE happen again, I'm very, very sure that a lot of the Chinese trying to fund as much, like building our own chipset as fast, and it's still I still think there's a long way to go. But all these various different political movements, in some way, will sort of corner China to want to fight back to develop even more.
I'm going to throw it open to the floor because unfortunately we're running. Very fast hand over there, please. How many mics have we got? 2, yes, and then can we have the other one over here, please? Thanks very much.
Thank you. My name is Sergi, the Economic Club of Hong Kong. So I have a question about the Greater Bay Area and China's attempt to build it as China's response to Silicon Valley. Would you agree with that? You would see there is good trends and good developments in that? And follow-up question to that, what do you see the role of Hong Kong in the Greater Bay Area, and also do you see really Hong Kong as like gateway for Chinese startups to the world? Thank you.
We'll take the other question straight as well.
You were mentioning the military applications. What would you guys talk about with the role of the government as a customer? For example, Google employees were protesting against working for the Pentagon even before they were protesting the censored version. So, yeah.
Thank you. Benjamin, perhaps you could take the military one.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Sergey. Good to see you again. Silicon Valley is unique. There are so many places, including many places in the US, who try to replicate another Silicon Valley, but it's a combination of factors, including higher education institutions, of the early industries, which actually has a lot to do with the military. A lot of people would agree that Silicon Valley, especially the semiconductor industry, was essentially on the back of the earlier NASA and the military projects based in the valley close to Stanford. And I'm not sure about the future of Hong Kong. In the Silicon Valley, where both Edith and I used to live, we tend to use the analogy of pirates with the entrepreneurs and cowboy investors. So guess what? 150 years ago, before the Opium War, Hong Kong was literally the hiding place for pirates. So Hong Kong just needs to go back to its roots in some way.
Fantastic. Edith, did you want to add anything?
I love Hong Kong. I'm born and raised in Wan Chai. I'm either in Wan Chai or in Soma. So I think that what one of the questions was asking, will Hong Kong become sort of the stepping stone for Chinese entrepreneur going overseas? I would love to see that, but I think that is probably the other way around. And I really hope that not all the foreign conglomerate go to Singapore instead of Hong Kong to set up shop as their Asian headquarters. It really should be Hong Kong. The laws, the IP, everything just make it so much easier. And I really would like to see a lot more of all these awesome companies to set up shop in Hong Kong and think about this is the best place for them to go into China and go to Southeast Asia. It's just so convenient. I'd love to see more of that. If you think about it, we like to sort of compare Silicon Valley versus the Bay Area to the Great Bay Area. In San Francisco, it's less than 1 million people. It's like smaller than Wan Chai, really. And yet everybody sort of talk about it. It's not because Bay Area is a big market. It's really because there's so much big brain trust with amazing university like Stanford and Berkeley, and all the Google, Facebook, Apple are all there. That's why we, for the Great Bay Area, should think about education, great university to groom to talent. And on top of that, of course, it's great that we already have Tencent, DJI, but all these guys need to be in Hong Kong so we can attract more great for potential M&A, not just going public, but also these talent and these employees will leave and start great companies. Then we can create a true ecosystem. Government policy will help, but it's really the people that matter. And we need to think about all facets to really bring and build a true Great Bay Area.
And on that note, a call to arms for Hong Kong. I'm afraid we have to wrap it up. But thank you all to everyone in my final panel. I'm extremely grateful for joining me.
Thank you.
I'm going to introduce now a video which in turn will introduce a fabulous choir who are going to sing for us this evening, The Unsung Heroes.
I was a teacher before, but my salary is not enough.
A Bachelor of Science in Commerce, major management.
Was working in a bank.
My parents took care of my son since his first year. And I was in the airplane for his first birthday.
When I left her, he's only 3 years old.
Oh, after 1 year here in Hong Kong, I have a chance to see my kids. And then my youngest daughter didn't recognize me.
My message to my son is that, of course, I wish I could kiss you every night. And it is always my wish. And it makes me so sad every night. Since your first year that I was not around during your growing up.
My message to my children, it's relates the song that we are singing for them, the unsung heroes. I wish I could kiss them goodnight every night.
Very thankful because I can relate my life with the song. I said important message to my son, just to be study hard and don't forget to love me. Even I am so far away, I know I love you as I love you everything. You are my life, you are my strength, everything.
Far away, and hope I see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. That was absolutely inspiring. Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for the Unsung Heroes Choir. Absolutely wonderful. Wonderful. Inspiring, and it's amazing the way that music talks to you. And that's in a way, that's the sort of closing thought I think we have to end on today, is that one of the great benefits of the open society is that when you're open to ideas and people from elsewhere, when you make an effort to put yourself in other people's shoes, to think the way other people think, to sort of imagine or ask them about their experiences, it leads to possibly a greater global understanding, certainly a greater chance of harmony, that word we mentioned earlier, and a greater chance of exchanging ideas. So I thought, in the spirit of thinking about what it is that we have in common with other people who are very different, I tried to ask myself what I, for example, have in common with Xi Jinping, the president of China. And not much. But I thought of three things. One, we've both spent time in the American state of Iowa. Me as a political journalist, him living with a nice American family there. Two, we're often very baffled by the things that Donald Trump says. And three, we've both been likened to Winnie the Pooh. So when I was a little boy, on my first day at a particular school, I had a very big jar of honey, and which I'd been given, and I ate an awful lot of honey sandwiches, and my schoolmates likened me to Winnie the Pooh, the bear of very little brain. And I naturally reacted to that by laughing it off and thinking nothing the worse for it. Now, I contrast that with the response in China, where recently the film version of Winnie the Pooh, or Christopher Robin, the latest in the Pooh franchise, was banned from cinemas because people might think that someone was making some kind of suggestion that Xi Jinping, a man who, like many men of a certain age, starts to resemble a little bit in profile the great bear, Winnie the Pooh, who's, well, honey does that to you. And then I thought, he probably didn't even directly order that. That's just the self-censorship, the thing, we cannot let this, entirely harmless movie about a boy who loves his teddy bear be distributed around China in case the Supreme Leader for Life thinks that we're making fun of his middle-aged spread. And I'm thinking, if you can't even put a film about a bear on the screen here, how are you going to be brave enough to tell the president that maybe there might be something going wrong with the Belt and Road Initiative, or maybe there might be a problem with environmental standards in some part of China, or there might be a difficulty with food safety? I worry about that, and I don't know the answer to that. But I do know the answer to two things. Firstly, that there is a donation box for the unsung choir out there, so please give generously. Secondly, that if you want to watch the London and New York arms of the Open Future Festival, you can live stream them on the app, which you will all no doubt have downloaded from the App Store by now. And thirdly, out of two, we can continue the conversation next door, where in order to aid our thinking, there is the opportunity for some drinking. So that concludes today's Hong Kong arm of the Open Future Festival, and thank you all very much for coming to our party. Thank you.
Blackbird singing in the dead of night.